Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca. My co-host Rob Brant and I are joined today by Dallas Smith, president of Nanwakolas Council and the board chair for Coast Funds. In this Drumbeats episode, we discuss his background and the impact of Coast Funds on the Great Bear Rainforest. Coast Funds, an endowment of nearly $500 million, was created to support conservation and economic development in the Great Bear Rainforest, protecting 3.1 million hectares and generating over $100 million for economic development. Smith highlighted the importance of Indigenous involvement in conservation financing, and we also discussed the potential for free trade amongst Indigenous communities worldwide. He also touched more deeply on the role of tourism, particularly wildlife viewing, in supporting local economies and the challenges of balancing development with conservation.
Dallas Smith, President, Chair of Nanwakolas Council, also Chair of Coast Funds, and wearing some other hats, literally and figuratively. Thanks for taking the time to join us on Drumbeats.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And my hat.
Pleasure to have you. Yes, and the hat collection is distinctive. As we talked earlier before the program, it used to be an element of style for just about every man. So you're maintaining the standards for the rest of us. So thank you for that. I can't wait to get outside and get on my hat and look the part.
There we go.
Great to have you with us, as Rob said, Dallas. Just to come into the session a little bit now. So, Dallas, you have roots from all four corners of the Kwakwala speaking peoples. How has this broad cultural foundation shaped your approach to business and leadership? And why don't you talk a little bit about your background, just to introduce to our audience over here in the UK and beyond?
Yeah, no, again, thanks for having me. It's always nice to be able to share some perspective and to be able to share some Indigenous perspective in the United Kingdom, something that I couldn't pass up. But my name's Dallas Smith. I grew up actually in the lower mainland of Vancouver. My parents come from remote First Nations communities on the north end of Vancouver Island, and they didn't want me to go to school in the North Island because the school system had some challenges in those days. There was still quite a bit of racism and still some other social challenges that the communities were facing. And so they decided when they found out they're having me that we were going to go suburban. And so I had the luxury of both worlds. I kind of grew up in suburban Vancouver, but would go home 3-4 times a year for various cultural events. And then as I got a little bit older, I would go home to go fishing every summer with my uncles and different things. So I kind of like to say I got the best of both worlds. I got a very solid kindergarten to grade 12 education. Grade 12 might have taken 2 times, but we don't need to talk about that too much. But yeah, so like I said, I got to learn the perspective of being kind of an urban First Nations kid, but also, got enough cultural support and background to grow up knowing who I was and where I came from and being able to be very proud of that, which was somewhat of a bit of a challenge in the late 70s, early 80s when I was growing up, and really still is today, just with the rural-urban divide that exists, and First Nations really get caught up in that. But happy to be here.
Well, great to have you. And as Rob's a golfer and I'm a fisherman, you've kind of covered both the bases. So I'm sure we'll have a great conversation then. Rob.
There we go.
Yeah, Dallas, you're involved with some really, really interesting, impactful organizations. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about Coast Funds?
It's ironic. I'm here actually for a celebration on Coast Funds that we're having over the next couple of days here in Vancouver right now. Coast Funds was an endowment that was brought together to make the Great Bear Rainforest work from a First Nations point of view. For years, we were involved at a planning table and we watched the environmentalists and the forest companies fight over our backyards, really. There was a big boycott on BC wood products in Europe at the time. kind of mid 90s. It's called the War in the Woods. And the environmentalists were getting so sophisticated that they went to Europe, where so much BC pulp and paper was used in the magazine industry. And I had learned that, most of the magazines throughout Europe and North America were printed in Germany. And so there was a real big focus on BC wood products in Germany. And the government of British Columbia had to weigh in and start, bringing some remedies to the situations around clear cut logging and some of those things that were happening in British Columbia. And so First Nations were invited to join this planning table that was called the Central Coast LRMP, Land and Resource Management Plan, just for those who hate acronyms as much as I do. And it was a planning process that brought together all the stakeholders. And the First Nations at the time were just trying to really find their stride on where we fit within the world. We knew we had jurisdiction over our reserves, but we had these vast traditional territories that we really didn't have much input on. And so the chiefs of the day decided that we better join this process. But we told the government of British Columbia that we'd only join if they recognized us as a government. And so we coordinated ourselves and got together and we went through a terms of reference and got into this planning process. But then we slugged it out for years with all the different stakeholder groups. And one of the challenges that we had was we weren't really involved in the forest industry directly at that point in time. But we also didn't want to see the opportunities lost through the development of protected areas. And so one of the great chiefs in the North Coast, a chief named Percy Starr from the village of Clem 2, challenged the environmentalists to make conservation pay for itself. How can you make conservation become an economic driver for our communities? And to the environmental activists' credit, they took them up on that challenge and they they introduced conservation financing to us. And so that was a way of where philanthropic dollars were being raised to level against future protected areas. And so we protected 3.1 million hectares throughout the Great Bear Rainforest, roughly the size of Ireland, I've been told, when we compare it to, different sizes and categories. But there was a $120 million economic development fund that was developed as a result of those negotiations. And that's what Coast Fund was. It was $60 million of private philanthropic dollars matched by 30 million from the province and 30 million by the federal government. And so out of that $120 million, 60 million is a sinking fund where we've been spending it down over the years. We thought it was going to take about 8 years to spend it down, but it took about 15 to spend it down because of leveraging opportunities. But then the other 60 million is in an endowment that we only live off the interest from. And so different First Nations have different projects and different priorities. And over the years, they pool their earnings and take it out in various chunks of money for various stewardship initiatives. And so Coast Funds was something that was developed by other people for First Nations. But over the 15 years, and it's actually 15, probably 18 years now since we've actually developed the concept. It's a lot more First Nations led now. We actually have more First Nations people on the board. We have strategic plans that are developed in conjunction with First Nations communities. But Coast Funds is the first placeholder for an economic development fund like that, which later became what's called a project for permanence. And so there's different conservation initiatives throughout the world right now that include Indigenous people. There's 11 of them being negotiated right now, and 2 of them were in the Great Bear Rainforest. One's on the terrestrial side, and the second one represents our marine interests. When we finished the terrestrial negotiations and that 3.1 million hectares of conservation land, et cetera, all the other things that came with it, our elders reminded us that we're coastal people. So to just do the terrestrial part left it unfinished. And so while we really enjoyed the opportunities we leveraged through the terrestrial negotiations, we knew that it wasn't going to be complete until we completed a marine component. So after the terrestrial part was done, we buckled down and we did marine stewardship plans and marine operating plans, which have resulted in a marine protected areas strategy, which has brought in another chunk of philanthropic dollars, matched by $200 million by Prime Minister Trudeau a couple of years at COP15, when Canada made its commitment to the 30 by 30 biodiversity issues, where they're going to protect 30% of Canada's biodiversity. So we worked with the federal federal government in helping them achieve some of those goals. And we simply added to the sinking fund that we have. So Coast Funds now manages over $435 million on behalf of First Nations groups up and down the coast of British Columbia in the Great Bear Rainforest.
Wow.
Oh, that's can't believe how far we've gone until you actually spin it all out in kind of one long line.
Incredible. Explain just where we're talking about, Great Bear Rainforest.
So the Great Bear Rainforest, and by the way, I couldn't stand the name when I was a young negotiator, full of vinegar and the other stuff that matches with vinegar when you're using those terms. But the Great Bear Rainforest extends from Comox on Vancouver Island and the adjacent mainland up to the Alaskan border, so the bottom of the Alaskan Panhandle where Prince Rupert is. That's sort of the area that encompasses the Great Bear Rainforest. And so there's 26 different First Nations who are involved in the original terrestrial round, and there's 17 involved in the newly formed marine component.
I think even today there'd be some Canadians who don't realize there is a rainforest on the West Coast.
Definitely last intact temperate rainforest in North America, actually, which was the reason why the environmentalists put so much money and effort into the area, because of the connected biodiversity values that went from one part of the coast to the top of the coast. And so while we do have a history of logging, we also have tremendous old growth forests that house a bunch of flora and fauna and all the animals and whatnot. And there's a connectivity issue that helped to make it possible. So if you actually look at the map, there's different protected areas that come down the coast as we work through the process. And again, I think it was Ireland was kind of the European equivalent of the size of area that we're talking. So pretty vast.
And is the fund, so you're managing more funds from First Nations, different First Nations. Are you looking at what is the future for Coast Funds? Are you looking for more third-party funding to do more?
Definitely. There's always a growth plan. We find out no matter how much money you have in management, you always sort of need more if you're going to complement the visions of the communities that you're helping to work with and represent. So the idea is to have functioning stewardship offices for all the First Nations within the Great Bear Rainforest. And so that means having a set amount of funding each year that they can actually plan around. In the early stages of stewardship visions and all those sorts of things, it was really part-time work because we could never get the funding to have someone work full-time in the stewardship of their territories. And so Coast Fund's goal is to make sure that we have that capacity year round. And so we're still working with different industries. The cruise ship industry is one that's of, notable example that we're working with to say, okay, we've made decisions on protection that help the viewscapes of commercial cruise line traffic that's going through. And so we're asking them to invest in the future that we're trying to develop in the Great Bear Rainforest. There's some other seafood industries that we're still trying to get to the table to, ante up and get into the game a little bit. I think we all benefit from sustainable management of natural resources, but also keeping the ecological beauty that's in place, the intact temperate rainforest, the marinescapes. And so we want people using our territories to become part of that. And to become part of that, they have to invest in it. And it's not like the old days where it sounds like a shakedown where we're sort of saying, pay the toll or you're not coming through. It's just, let's complement the vision that has been developed over the years. And as people want to partake in that, there's an accountability that we'd like to have people at the table working with us.
Yes, I think Canada's a modern country. We don't have shakedowns in Canada.
No, well, I mean,
anymore.
we're
But our southern neighbor, I'm not sure about these days.
Yes. That's been an interesting side of it. As we develop the 3.1 million hectares of protected area, there's still operating areas that a lot of our communities depend on. We're still loggers at the end of the day. We're still fishermen by trade at the end of the day. And having ourselves caught in the global awareness of tariff issues has been a bit of an eye-opener for us. Now that we finally own forest tenure and we're developing these resources and part of the actual equity of these businesses getting hit by 35% tariffs and duties is something that we've just never fathomed before. So it's an interesting time for us trying to learn how to work with not only our nations and the forest companies that we're working with, but we're also talking to different indigenous groups in the United States and around the world about exploring free trade opportunities, indigenous community to indigenous community free trade opportunities. And so that's one of the tools we're working on right now to try and mitigate the impacts of softwood lumber and the countervailing duties that have been imposed by President Trump over the last couple months.
And just coming back to, you mentioned early in your career, Europe was a destination for paper, particularly in Germany for the publishing houses. Is that still a viable market? Is BC still active?
BC doesn't send as much over anymore just because of the digital age now. People, people aren't buying National Enquirer and all the tabloids and all the other magazines that our wood products were used for. But we are trying to diversify our markets around the world. And Europe still is, a trading partner with us for some of our forest resources. But we're also in competition with Finland and Russia and other places that have, some vast fiber opportunities. So it's that's an interesting side of the game that, a rural remote First Nations community at 200 people don't realize where they fit in the global stage on some of these issues right now. So it's a bit of an awakening for some of our communities for sure.
And the idea of free trade between Indigenous peoples, that there is it's not a free trade agreement, but a memorandum signed by Canada, I think New Zealand, for maybe even the US and Australia. Is it to look at ways for Indigenous people to cooperate and trade more? Is there an angle, you think, to actually achieve free trade across some of those borders?
In theory, it's doable. We have the Jay Treaty in the United States, which gives us nation to nation trade across the border for more traditional goods that, we've used across the border. Again, the 49th parallel crosses so many Indigenous communities. There's so many Indigenous communities that span that 49th parallel. And so the Jay Treaty was really about acknowledging the right of those communities to trade back and forth. But we think that there's opportunities within there that we're preparing to explore right now. We're talking to a number of nations along the Columbia River, between Washington State and Oregon State. We're talking to a couple nations in the Southwest around opportunities to start trading lumber into the communities. And we're really sort of interested and curious on how either government's going to react. It's one of those things like, oh, you crazy Indians, here you for crazy First Nations, here you go plotting and scheming about things you're going to do. And we're trying to figure out, what is the best way to start the discussion? Do we send 50,000 trillion board feet across on a container barge? Do we send one truckload hoping that that's all that's going to be confiscated? So we're in the fun time of trying to figure out how we can do it. We've sort of built a bit of a process and we've got a bit of a roadmap. Now someone's actually got to, mechanize it and do the first run sort of, and I don't want to say across the border because that really makes it sound like we're doing something sketchy, but who's going to be the first one who actually opens up a viable trade opportunity? So it's good to try find solutions to problems that other people create.
Yeah, well, as a Mohawk, I'm keenly aware of those cross-border issues
Definitely.
and the Jay Treaty, which, just to give a bit of background, was a treaty signed between the US and the British government back in the late 1700s following the American Revolution, and there were still some loose ends to tie up. So in the late 20 years after the war had ended, they signed this treaty to help clarify some border issues and some other trade issues. And among that, within that treaty, there's a clause about Indigenous peoples and their ability to work and trade across the border. And the U.S. government did ratify it and enact it into law. You can look on the U.S. State Department's website today, and it'll describe what you have to do to be able to take advantage of those provisions when you come into the U.S. Canadian government never did ratify it or enact it into law, and so there's a question about enforceability on this side of the border. But Yeah, that's a really interesting.
Growing up on the border in White Rock in suburban Vancouver, it was really about getting cheaper milk and eggs when we could go across the line back in the 80s. But yeah, no, it's interesting to take, you know, colonial constructs such as different treaties that weren't signed really by any of our nations, but using loopholes or using opportunities that exist within them to try further a jurisdictional discussion that's really a lot more prevalent than people think. Dealing with some of these issues in Canada, we're finally starting to talk to, some of the Mohawks and talk to other people across Canada about, okay, we're all facing similar problems. How can we band together a little bit? And that's something we're really hoping to put some pressure on the Assembly of First Nations to start looking at outside of the box thinking. Too
Hmm.
long as First Nations people put these boxes around us and we've just stayed within them because we're very polite. We're very, peaceful people. But we've got to learn to start looking outside of the box a little bit. And this is one of the things around trade that we think we're going to not only get some attention to the issues that are there, but hopefully some solutions.
Yes, and I think that's one of the that Canada has to be doing now as well, thinking outside the box. How do we realize the full potential of Canada that's built on the foundation of the Indigenous people? And how do we chart a new path where all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can live together and succeed and grow a society that delivers for everybody in the country, as well as also as a bit of a beacon for the world to say this is how to get things done and how to create a great country that appeals to all and newcomers as well. So that will be interesting. And of course, treaties have been used for such a long time to hold back the potential of the Indigenous people. It's good you're finally at the spot. Well, how do we leverage some of these? And I'm sure the Canadian government would love it if you're able to be shipping a bunch of stuff across the border for lumber.
I think there's more cheerleaders for us than we originally thought when we started the concept. I mean, there's not
Yes.
many who are saying, yeah, I'll jump in the truck with you, but
No,
there's a few saying, yeah, you should try that. That's a good
no,
idea.
not
We'll
many.
bail
So
you out.
I wouldn't volunteer to jump in that truck either.
No,
But
thankfully, I don't have an air brakes license, so it won't
yes,
be me.
okay, solves that problem too. Great, really interesting.
Dallas, he touched on some of the tourism initiatives, but it's such a beautiful part of the world that we've been talking about. What else is going on up there that you're looking at generating?
Tourism's an interesting one. It's something that's always been dangled in front of us. When people are trying to stop us from developing natural resources, tourism's the first thing that sort of gets thrown. I won't say in our face in that sort of fashion, but it's something that gets dangled in front of us. And, tourism is such a subjective term that we're really trying to figure out how we fit within that within the Great Bear Rainforest. Some of us have gotten into wildlife viewing, understanding that while we may take for granted growing up within the Great Bear Rainforest and all the animal species that are a part of it, how iconic they all are, we forget how much of a taste and a flavor this is for other parts of the world. And so in 2017, Nanwakolas Council, the organization that's my day job, we acquired a business called Night Inlet Grizzly Tours. And so we run a remote grizzly bear viewing operation in the middle of Knights Inlet. And this is one of the great things about doing your guys' podcast is 90% of our clientele is from outside of North America. It's people who want to come see a grizzly bear. They want to see a spirit bear. They want to see whales. They want to see eagles. And there's a real opportunity for us to braid in or weave in, if you will, some traditional ecological knowledge within the actual, wildlife experience. And so we can talk about our relationship with some of these animals and how we've managed to coexist with them for 10,000, 12,000 years as we're starting to find out in some of these areas. And so that's been an eye opener for us on just how much opportunity there is in tourism. And so we're really looking at what are some of the infrastructure needs that we have because we are in remote communities. I'm in the southern part of the Great Bear Rainforest where everything's a 35-minute flight from Vancouver. So we have a few more opportunities than others to draw people in. But there's other areas within the remote part of the Great Bear Rainforest that you can only get to by seaplane or by boat. And so we're really trying to have a bigger ticket regional discussion on what kind of infrastructure do we need to draw in enough tourism to invest in opportunities like that, but not to turn into Whistler or other, iconic places where you just have so much foot traffic that it eventually starts to degrade the actual ecological natural experience. So we're at a bit of a crossroads on, how much do we want to develop for tourism and how much do we just want to build some subtle infrastructure that helps us promote tourism? And different nations are taking some different approaches that we're starting to share with each other.
Well, in the interest of promoting this a little bit, can you explain to certainly me the difference between a great bear and a spirit bear?
So it's really, go back to, why I didn't like the name the Great Bear Rainforest is the the Kermode bear, the spirit bear, if you will, it's a white bear. So it's a black bear that has recessive genes. It's an albino black bear. And it only occurs in certain parts of the Great Bear Rainforest. They don't have them in the southern parts of the Great Bear Rainforest. They don't exist. But up in Klemtu and Hartley Bay and some of those areas a little bit farther up the coast, these bears exist. And so we got a little bit jealous about it. And I used to tease and say, my elder said those bears weren't smart enough to be black. They're not iconic. They're just not smart enough to be black. But it drew people. It became British Columbia's animal. It was our symbol for animal was the great bear. And the marketing of the Great Bear Rainforest is really what gave it its place name and brought that international notoriety. And so, yeah, there's grizzly bears, which are brown bears. They're big and they're iconic, and they really do what they do because they're big and they're the alpha. They're the top of the food chain. But these other bears and species kind of all fit within there, and there's such a willingness around the world for people to learn about them now that even myself, I get quite anxious and ambitious about the fact that people want to come see not only the bears, but the people who coexisted with these bears. And so there's a lot of interest in indigenous ecotourism that really does some storytelling that, again, we're trying to figure out how to stay culturally appropriate, but also be able to, turn some marketable opportunities around there. It not only helps from the lodge and the employment point of view, but some of our young artisans are able to, help supply some of our gift shops and some of those things. So there's such a little trickle down effect that we're trying to figure out how to realize as efficiently as we can on the coast.
For people like me who want to visit, want to book, where do we go to find more information?
So I do got to say, Night Inlet Grizzly Tours. We go on the search engine. Night Inlet Grizzly Tours is our operation. It's a 35-minute float plane ride from Campbell River, and then you have an all-inclusive experience that we put out. We have a floating lodge in the middle of one of our estuaries. And so we have 11 different wildlife viewing opportunities that have you seeing everything from seals to eagles to bears, whales. There's a marine tour that goes with it. And then Haida House on Queen Charlotte Islands, Haida Gwaii, as it's been renamed, thanks to the perseverance of the Haida Nation. They own a couple ecotourism opportunities within their territories. And then there's Spirit Bear Lodge in Clem 2, again, where you can go see these beautiful Kermode bears that exist in these areas. So those are three of the more iconic mainstream opportunities that we have. And now other nations are trying to find out how they can fit within that. We call it the Golden Triangle. So when Europeans come to Canada or the West Coast specifically, they want to go on an Alaskan cruise. They want to see the Rockies and they want to go see grizzly bears. And so we call it the Golden Triangle for our planning purposes. And we're trying to figure out how to fill in some gaps that exist in there because people come over for 5-6 weeks at a time and they do their 3 booked mainstay kind of draws that they come through. But then there's little cities like Bella Bella, there's Port Hardy, there's Alert Bay. And so there's little places where we're trying to add some value added tourism that complete the experience for our guests.
Bella Bella was in the news this past summer, wasn't it? I think Elon Musk and some others visited. Dallas, we haven't spoken about your other day job, which is president and chair of Nanwakolas Council. Tell us a bit about that council.
Yeah, thank you. Nanwakolas is a Kwakwala word for a place we go to find agreement. It's a little bit prophetic, really within our language. And so in the years of slugging it out with the environmentalists and all the different stakeholder groups, we were trying to do spatial planning, and our First Nations were gathering under tribal councils. Tribal councils are a construct of the Indian Act. The Department of Indian Affairs manages our regional organizations, and they provide some funding, but even funding that they didn't provide had to be spent and accounted for on a fiscal year by fiscal year basis. And so when our audits would show that we had leftover dollars, it would get taken out of next year's opportunity for funding. And so the chiefs told us to go build an organization that was an arm's length from government, that didn't have that overreaching from Ottawa, that gave us the ability to do spatial planning, to do that kind of planning from the grassroots up towards the political level. Took a couple years, and so we kept tripping. We couldn't get it done in a year, and then we try to get the next funding and try to get it done in a year again. And so we spent about 4 years just working frantically trying to get something done that we couldn't get done. And so the chiefs asked me to go, and the actual way they put it was, go build us a boat that can fish in provincial waters, federal waters, but it's ours. And so they asked us to build Nanwakolas Council, and a group of 10 nations came together to form us back in 2007 is when we first incorporated, as the Great Bear Rainforest was starting to wrap up. We were getting close to finalizing our negotiations with the stakeholders, and then we were going to go into government to government negotiations. And so we built Nanwakolas to do those government to government negotiations and start to bring some economic opportunity that wasn't going to be interfered with by the Department of Indian Affairs. There's a similar organization to ours called Coastal First Nations of the Great Bear Initiative. They're the farther up the coast. And so we represent the North Island and adjacent mainland. And as you go farther up the coast, Central Coast First Nations is an entity that's similar to Nanwakolas that works with the nations there. So they're a group of nations, we're a group of nations, and we work together trying to develop policy and different things. Nanwakolas has found some success in working with the provincial government on Crown land referrals. One of the challenges we had as we were going through the planning process was Crown land is never just stagnant. It's always being used for different opportunities. There's tree farm licenses. There's different kind of temporary development opportunities that different companies hold opportunity and hold the cards to use. And so we started working with the province on the management of Crown land, which started to give us some jurisdiction outside of our reserves. Those actual small little postage stamp reserves that we have in British Columbia, we started to be able to actually talk about our territories as a whole. And Nanwakolas was instrumental in helping us just be able to manage outside of our reserves. And so it's been a tremendous organization. Our membership's gone up and down as it goes. We're sort of a buffet. Our organization doesn't have any rights or title. We simply work with the nations who do. And so from time to time, a chief will come in and say, we think we can do better on our own, or we're going to go do this for a while. And so we just work with those who are willing to work with us, and we give core support. So some of our nations vary in capacity from 400 members to 1,500 members. And so they have various levels of capacity. Nanwakolas has a bunch of foresters. We've got marine biologists. We've got mappers. And so we've got general capacity that those nations can use at their comfort level and their need level to help them develop their own internal plans. But once those plans were developed, we realized that if we wanted to change policy, we had to do it in group chunks. We couldn't, on a territory by territory, define policy because we had shared territories, overlaps, if you will, as some people like to put them. So Nanwakolas has really been there as a place to find agreement on how we go forward with a lot of these initiatives. And we've been able to work with the last 3 or 4 successive governments, both in Canada and British Columbia, on staying at the front end of helping develop policy that takes UNDRIP and all these other catchwords that we use to work with Indigenous peoples. And we're actually trying to build some sustainable policy around it.
Love to see
Wow.
First Nations working together and leveraging and cooperating. That's fantastic. Maybe last question. What are you doing in your spare time these days, Dallas, when you're not watching bears and eagles? And
I'm wondering if my wife's going to catch on to this. My wife doesn't follow my career as closely as she used to since we've had 3 children. But I like to golf. I lost my leg in a motorcycle accident when I was 18 years old. And, I'd played soccer and hockey and done all the sort of things that Canadian kids do. And I needed something physical, as I was recovering from my injuries. I had to deal with some, medication issues as I was coming out of that. And I just needed something to do. And so someone recommended my father and I start playing golf together. And we're under the Hereditary system in my community. So it was really beneficial. We started spending a lot of time playing golf together. And
The Hereditary system. What do you mean
so
by
the
that?
Hereditary system. So right now, most of our communities go under, we're all under the Indian Act,
Right.
but most of them have elections every 2 to 4 years, depending on
Yes.
the band code that you have and what you've been able to negotiate. My nation, because we've been chased out of our homeland, our people are sort of nomadic right now. So there's a few nations, specifically within British Columbia, that are under what's called the custom system. So my father's been chief since 1982 of our community. And so we've over the last year and a half, we've been working on a transition process where I'm slowly, learning more than just the Great Bear Rainforest, learning about the social side, the education side. And so, we're working together to try to transition what our leadership's going to look like going forward. And golf ended up being a powerful tool for us because we'd spend 5 hours playing around the golf where I'd talk about, okay, well, you got to learn to hit your wedge like this. Or, when you're putting, think about this. And he's like, well, when you're talking about the trees, you got to learn this. And this watershed flows there because of this reason. And so there's an epistemology that was happening between us that we didn't realize till years later that, wow, all that time we spent on the golf course, sometimes arguing, was very beneficial to us. So golf's just one of those great games that brings people together. And it was something that I found to just help fill some of my energies and time as I was dealing with the trauma of the leg injuries that I sustained.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a great conversation.
This is, as we're starting to bring more awareness to different First Nations issues, it's amazing how many different audiences there are that want to be part of the discussion. When I first got your guys' first email, it's kind of like, is this a spam thing? Like, what's this Indigenous connection to the United Kingdom from? And then I talked to one of our mutual friends, Stuart Muir and Stu McNish, and some of these guys are like, no, you got to go do it. This is, you're talking about wanting people to buy into what First Nations people are doing. And this is how you do it. You share stories, you share some time together. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys. And as I have my own podcast called Res Dog Walkers on all the normal platforms, hopefully you guys can come on and we can continue this discussion a little bit because this has been very amazing for me.
Yeah, no,
We'd
would love
we'd
to
love
do
to.
that, Dallas. Thanks for spending a bit of time with us, and loved learning all about that most beautiful part of the world, the west coast of Canada. So
Yes,
Well,
thank you very
appreciate
much.
the opportunity, and maybe we'll meet halfway and we'll meet in your territory. I've always been looking for a reason to get back to Akwesasne. So
Well, we want you over in London, Dallas.
there you go. Well, it's on the way. I can fly to Montreal. We can do an episode of Montreal. We can do a 3-parter. This will be good.
Exactly. That would be great. Okay, thank
Trilogy.
you very
There we
much.
go. This will be the next great trilogy.
Yes.
I was golfing in Ganawagi just a couple of days ago, Dallas. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate the time.
Great.
All right.
Thank you to Dallas Smith for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.